thank Rick for taking some time to share with us his thoughts on conflict management. So with that, Rick, I'm going to give it to you.
Okay, sounds good. Looks like we got a intimate crowd here today. I see Vicky. I'm not sure which Vicky that is, but what I'd like to get is, since we do have a small crowd, let me ask, what do you want to get out of this session today? You know, what can I add to your knowledge base? So,
do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. How are you, Rick?
Good, Robert.
Me, I mean, the name of it is managing conflict, right?
Well, and then tied to the DISC assessment. So it's really, you know, two topics melded into one, because that's the tool that you have that really allows you to enable a meaningful conflict management conversation.
Okay. Is that typically when you're using DISC for multiple people so they can understand their individual traits and how to work with each other?
Sure.
Okay. I haven't had that opportunity yet. So
okay.
It would be good to hear more about it.
Okay. Sounds good. Hey, Arnie.
Hi.
How you doing? What do you want to get out of this session today?
Oh, okay. I want to hear how you debrief the DISC with people.
Okay. All right.
Actually, me too.
Okay. I will do that. Virginia?
Hi there.
How you doing?
I don't really have any preconceived notions about the session. I was just interested in learning more about your perspective and from other people on the call.
Okay. Sounds good. Cheryl?
Yeah, it's just been a while since I've used it, so it's kind of like a refresher for me. And
Okay.
how it's used. Thanks.
Okay. Sounds good. Mike, how about you?
I just came in, so tell me the question.
What do you want to get out of today? I just want to make sure I hit all the right spots so that, you know, my own preconceived notion of what I might deliver isn't, you know, hits the mark.
So as I understand, the topic is conflict resolution using advanced insights. And so
using the DISC, but we will
Using the
cover
DISC,
AI a little
right.
bit.
okay. And so it's another tool in the bag. So I have no preconceived notions of what to get other than some knowledge about something that might be useful to clients.
Cool. Vicky, how about you?
I basically know that you have all the intelligence that we need and you're good at giving things out that you've dealt with. So that's why I'm in.
Okay. That was not pre-scripted, by the way, just so everybody knows.
That was pretty good, though.
But thank you, Vicky. And then I see somebody at an 804 area code that doesn't have a name, so.
That's Cleveland Parker.
Hey, Cleveland, how you doing?
Good, Rick. How are you?
Good. What do you want to get out of today?
Well, I'm kind of like, I think her name was Vicky. I saw your name on the list, and I know that you're all-knowing, so I joined the call. But I did the title did catch my attention, and I've done a couple of debriefs, and we talk about how to and how not to communicate. But I'd like to get a flavor for how you debrief. Number one, and then also how you incorporate the context of conflict resolution.
Okay. So here's what we'd like to do. So a little bit about my background. I've been an affiliate since 2008. I've probably done, you know, close to a couple of thousand DISC assessments along with all the others. I probably do north of 20 team DISC assessments a year, and I have a specific layout that I use that I would be more than happy to share with you. I'm also a professor, as Arnie knows, a professor at several universities. One actually now, but when I became an affiliate, I was teaching at multiple. One of the classes I taught to MBA students was managing conflict in the workplace. And so I have a pretty good background both academically and operationally, and what is conflict, and to the point that anytime I debrief DISC, I always 100% use managing conflict as the context for how to put some of the DISC numbers into some sort of meaningful context. And I'll talk about how I do that and the like. But before we do that, I would, and Wendy will make this available to everybody on the site, same with the recording. I put together a couple 4 slides on what is conflict, because I think you have to understand that what conflict is. You can't throw it out there as a meaningful context if you truly don't understand what it is. So if you go to the next slide, can everybody see it?
I can, yeah.
Okay, all right. So yeah, there you go. So conflict is defined as an expressed struggle between a small number of interdependent parties arising from perceived interference from others in achieving their goals. So when you look at that definition, what are some of the key words you see?
Perceived.
Interdependent.
Interdependent, perceived. Arnie, why does perceived jump out at you?
Because what I perceive and what you perceive may not be the same perceiving.
Exactly right. So there is some level of perception involved in conflict. The interdependent part of it, it being here in Chicago, one of the examples I use, look, if you've got a Chicago Bears fan and a Green Bay Packers fan sitting in a bar arguing over who's got the better football team, those are not interdependent parties. Those are just people disagreeing on who's got the better football team. So what does interdependent mean?
We are dependent upon each other.
Right. And the implication in conflict is that interdependent parties are obligated, because of their interdependence, to find a solution. Right? So it's that element that suggests that conflict, they have to figure it out one way or the other. What else do you see? Other key words.
Agreement on the goals.
Okay, interference from achieving goals. So the implication there is that people have goals, and that, as trite as that seems, one of the things that I go through in anytime I debrief an assessment is the fact that no matter what assessment I debrief, it boils down to 2 questions. How is this helping me achieve my goals, or how is this holding me back from achieving my goals? And the implication in both cases is, do you have goals? So you'd be surprised. That would seem like an obvious question, but not everybody has goals, as we know as coaches. There's one more key word in there, or key phrase in there, that is important to this definition.
Express struggle.
The express struggle. So it is an express struggle, which means you can observe it, but it's an express struggle based on perception. So therein lies the rub with managing conflict. And oh, by the way, we never talk about eliminating conflict in the workplace. We always talk about managing conflict, which is why the DISC is such a powerful tool, especially working with teams, in the sense that it will always be there. As long as there's 2 people left on the planet, there will be conflict. It's just human nature. So it's an express struggle based on perceived interference between a small number of interdependent parties. So there is inherent motivation to figure it out one way or the other. And we're not always, when we say figure it out, as you'll see on another slide, it's not always win-win. So conflict has both a substantive, which are, think of them as resource and process goals, and emotional, which are more relationship and face goals, components to it. So there's two major moving parts to any conflict that have to be resolved. And when we talk about the DISC and how we use that, we have to keep both of those in mind. What do we mean by face goals, do you think?
What's on the surface? Oh, to actually face those goals. I'm sorry. Oh, no.
No, you were closer with the first definition. It's,
yeah, okay.
You know, how many times have we heard the term, you know, we're in an argument, we're in a conflict, and we want to save face.
Yeah.
Right? There's an element, you know, yes, the relationship we want to preserve or maybe we don't want to preserve it. I mean, there's, you know, some conflicts we just don't want to preserve the relationship, but we want to preserve face. And so that's all part of the emotional component, that it's not, you know, saving face is not always based on logical conversation. Then the last piece, which ties obviously directly to the DISC, is communications is both the cause and the cure. So when we think about any conflict that you might have gotten into, it was likely created out of ineffective communications. And in the same vein, effective communications, or the right kind of communications, is the cure. So when you think about the substantive and the emotional, you can start to see where communications would really have a key role in, especially in the cure. But I think we also have to understand, especially as you're debriefing a team, that communication is also part of the cause. I just had lunch today with the essentially the president of a client. We're in this ongoing top 7 leaders looking at all their communication styles, and I was just having this exact conversation about what caused it, and because the biggest conflict is between a high D and a high S. So, and the high S happens to be the CEO's son, and the high D happens to be the president. So, you know, all sorts of fun there. Questions so far?
No, other than you said earlier that what we're looking at right now is going to be available to us.
Yes, this short slide deck, absolutely. Wendy has it, so she'll make it available along with the recording of the video.
It'll be placed on the affiliate website under the Learning Lab library.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so on the next slide, we see that one of the things that comes into the conversation is not all conflict is bad. We tend to have this idea that it is, but most of the people that look at conflict as being bad tend to sit on the introverted side of the DISC profile. Anytime that I debrief, I publicly announce I've used conflict as a leadership tool pretty much my entire adult life, because any leader that has introduced change to an organization, almost by definition, has introduced conflict. Because when's the last time you were part of a change and everybody just raised their hand and said, oh yeah, we're all in, no problem, we're good to go? Right? Of course not. That almost, I've never heard it happening, actually. So as you can see there, this idea of the one axis of performance and the other axis on conflict intensity, you know, it illustrates that low intensity conflict has a negative impact on performance because, anybody?
Nobody cares.
Nobody cares, nothing gets done. Same old, same old. And so, you know, apathy, status quo, call it what you want, you know, sinks in. And of course, on the opposite end of the spectrum, when you have too high an intensity of conflict, you have chaos, and obviously lends itself to negative performance as well. The trick is getting into this purple zone that is just enough conflict to be constructive. And of course, the idea is, where are these boundaries, right? Where is this left and right boundary where, you know, too little is bad and too much is also bad, or negative, as it were. And this slide I've actually used, this diagram I've literally used with several of my executive coaching clients that are, very much type A, high D, my way, the highway, I win, you lose, name your descriptor. And I use this diagram to help facilitate their mindset into where is this left and right boundary that stays in the positive behavior. So the point here is that when we talk about conflict, don't let the conversation go to, well, that's all bad. It's not. Next slide. So here's an actual slide that maybe you recognize some of the terms here. Here's a slide I use to talk about, since communications is a behavior, we talk about the natural orientation style. And by the way, I use this slide with people who have not taken the DISC as well. So, but as you might imagine, those of you that have debriefed at least a couple of DISCs might recognize some of the language we use here. What is that natural orientation, that subconscious response based on experiences with similar conflict situations? We've all heard we're products of our past. So a very common, our common experiences with conflict in our past, of which we all have them, is going to formulate our natural response to conflict when it happens to us or when we're involved in it. And then, of course, the adaptive responses and our adaptive behavior being more of a conscious effort to change our behavior in different conflict situations. Now, of course, here's one place where the AI comes into place. It comes into play as well. Has everybody on the call familiar with the attribute index? Anybody not familiar with attribute index? Okay. So when you look at the way people think, it sits behind some of the behaviors that the DISC will show us, and then allows us to say, okay, here's how we can adapt our communication style to be able to get a more positive outcome. Again, at lunch today, high D. High Ds have a tendency to fix problems, but not necessarily teach others how to fix problems, especially when the person that needs to learn is a high S. And so I said, okay, how do you adapt your communication style so that you don't become the doer, you become the watcher and the teacher kind of a thing. So again, it's all about how we adapt our communication style. Next slide is really based on two axes. One is how much are you trying to satisfy your own concerns along the bottom axis, and how much are you concerned about the other's interests on the vertical axis. And so we get these five different management styles relative to conflict. Bottom left, when neither party really cares one way or the other, you get avoidance. When you care more about yours, in other words, you get into this win-lose scenario, you get into this competitive situation. We see competitive people. It's hard to make a direct analogy or connection to a specific disc style, but you see some of your very high Ds can get into this mode. Your high S's can be very much avoiders or accommodators. The thing is, all five of these can be used positively in any given situation. Any of you that have been married for a long, long time have likely accommodated at some point or another, because the relationship is more important than winning. When you're in the competitive mode, usually it's positive in a crisis. So it just demands quick, decisive action and deal with the consequences later. But up in the upper right-hand corner is really what you're looking for as a style of managing conflict collaboration. It's the only win-win solution there on that chart. Compromise, many people think of compromise as win-win, but in truth, it is lose-lose solely based on the fact that both parties give something up in order to reach that compromise. Questions?
Yeah, in DISC, with all of the studies, there's reams of information that you can go through, right? You can get the surface stuff, and you can have a good, deep conversation. It's meaningful. But if you really wanted to, and I've never shared this with any of my clients, I've only kind of looked at it for my own edification, but there are so many descriptors. There's so many predictions of how someone will operate in a given situation and what that means in a more holistic sense. Does this dovetail with that, or is this adding more information on top of it?
So I view conflict as a application of one's DISC style, right? Because you're right, there's all sorts of descriptors, which is why I don't use them. I don't use them in any of my debrief, because what I do, and I'll get into that here in a second, and it's because I want them to tell me the situations they're struggling with, right? So I don't go through this litany of descriptors because they may or may not resonate. By the way, just before we leave this chart, there is an assessment out there called the Killman conflict management assessment that actually will give you a vetted identification of whether you tend to be a collaborator, accommodator, avoider, a competitor, or a compromiser. So there actually is an industry assessment out there. It's called the Killman, for whatever that means to you, the Killman Conflict Management Styles Assessment. But to answer, to go back to the question, I don't use any of the descriptors. What I do is set up scenarios and let the client, the team itself, kind of talk through how they would use their communication style to handle those situations.
Okay.
All right. Other questions on just what conflict is and what conflict isn't, before we jump into how I debrief the DISC. Okay. So we can bag the presentation. All right. Hey, Linda, I didn't see you sneak in. How you doing? So
Good.
here's
a little late to the party. Sorry about that.
That's quite all right. So here's the typical DISC debrief and how I tie conflict into it. So as I said earlier, I'd probably do 20 plus team DISC assessments a year. Could be a team of 4 or 5, could be a team of 15, 16. Doesn't really matter. So what I do is, one of the things I do is I take page 19. Everybody remember what page 19 is? Communications insights for others. All right. So I take the here's what you do to communicate with John Doe, and I take all the here's what you do's, and I put them all onto one side of a piece of paper. Cut and paste, simple. And then I take here's the things to avoid, and I take all of those and I put them on a second sheet of paper, and I print those up and I laminate the two together. And those are a handout at the end of the debrief of the team. Because what that does is it's now a cheat sheet of sorts that allows every team member to say, okay, the next time I have a one-on-one with Linda, here's what I should do and here's what I should avoid. Oh, but tomorrow I have a one-on-one with Arnie, so here's what I should do and here's what I should avoid. So it gives that cheat sheet the ability to have it right there in black and white. And I have gotten feedback. It's I had one executive team a couple of months ago took one look at it and said, this right here was worth the price of investment. Just this document alone, because it puts in black and white the do's and don'ts. All right. And so why is that important? Because conflict is always going to happen. So here's the the other thing I do when I'm looking at the results. So I use a format that I believe I got from the network. I put it all in a spreadsheet, D, I, S, and C, put the names down the left-hand column, and I just put their numbers, right off their natural and adaptive. And then I color code whichever their high one is. If they're a high D, I put red in that particular cell. If they're a high C, I put blue in that particular cell. And it just gives a very quick visual to say, okay, who's the high and who's the low. And I show their natural style. And then on the next slide, I show their adaptive style. And in both cases, I'm looking for obviously the team profile, the team dynamic, is it all one style? I had a healthcare organization, 17 people, every single, with one exception, including the CEO and COO, with one exception, 16 I's and S's. One D who quit about 3 weeks later, all I's and S's. And I said, basically as a company, you like to talk about what needs to happen, but, generally nothing gets done. And 17 people smiled back at me and said, nailed it. So the whole idea is, we're looking for that visual, but secondarily, we're looking at, where do we have the relationships where somebody is very high in a dimension working closely with somebody who's very low in that same dimension, whether that dimension be D, I, S, or C, right? Because that's where conflict is going to happen. Anybody know why? Anybody remember why that's a signal for potential conflict?
Completely different point of view or operating style.
Sure, but so a high D, or let's pick on I's. So very high I working with a very low I. Both, in order to work together to find out where they can work together reasonably, both have to come out of their comfort zone into that middle space, wherever that middle space is. But both of them have to come out of their comfort zone. And so that almost in and by itself has the potential to create conflict. Because what if one of those two is the manager and the other one works for that manager? Who's going to pull rank? Right? Maybe the low I pulls rank and says, no, you high I, you got to come meet me where I am. That might work once, but it's not sustainable. And you can see where that conflict would come into play. So essentially from here on out, once I've shown the results, I use conflict as the context for the rest of the debrief, right? Because I know that, as we just said earlier, context is a given. Conflict is a given. It will always happen. There's no such thing as a team that has never experienced conflict. And a matter of fact, I'm sure many of you have read Lencioni's book, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. What managing conflict effectively is one of the 5 dysfunctions. So it stands to reason that if you're looking at the DISC as solely as a means of how to communicate, on a good day, you're missing some of the value of the tool itself. Questions so far?
Rick, just to clarify for me, I'm in the next couple of weeks going to do a debrief of a team of 16.
Okay.
So this is perfect timing. So you said you take the communications page and you do the four, the to do and to the avoid thing for all four styles, correct?
Well, it's not all four styles. It's, page 19
All
for
four.
every person has, the top half of the page has, here are the things to communicate effectively with Linda.
Right.
And here are the things to avoid. So what I would do is I would take Linda's results, Robert's results, Artie's results, Wendy's results. I would put them all on the front page. Now, a team of 16, that font's going to be too small. So it's going to be page 1 and 2 will be the do's, and page 3 and 4 will be the don'ts.
Okay.
But I would still laminate them and give everybody those 2 pages.
Okay.
And the do's and don'ts are coming right from page 19?
Correct.
Okay.
I just cut and paste. I cut and paste them into a Word document, and then, I can adjust the font sizes and margins, kind of make it look pretty and all that sort of thing. And then I just laminate it. And the lamination, the reason I laminate is because, nobody's going to lose that, right? It's going to stick out in a pile of papers. Because it's laminated, it'll survive coffee stains and, anything else you can do to it. Because we want people to use it. We want it to be out and present as they're having these conversations.
And the slides that you said you produce did you get that from trusted advisors, fill in the blanks kind of thing, or was that something you developed on your own?
I believe it started off with the format used in the AI team debrief, and I just embellished it for DISC and values as well.
Okay.
I mean, it's pretty much the similar idea.
Yep. Thank you.
And one of the things that one of the questions I get when I do that, when I let people know what I'm going to do, is should we put names or should we not? So once in 12 years, only once in 12 years have I debriefed it without names, because one person on the team felt it was, I was somehow singling them out, or, whatever the case may be. Now, another variation of this is I actually debriefed the DISC for 190 people in the entire company. And I just broke it down by business unit and looked at business unit profiles, and I didn't get down to individual names. I got down to individual teams. So, I mean, the visual you can use at a company level, and you can use the visual at a team level. The whole idea is the conversation and the context is pretty much the same. Is this helping you achieve your goals, or is it holding you back from achieving your goals? And where might the conflict occur when you look at, and even with teams, you can look at team profiles and say, is it really any wonder that operations is not getting along with sales because of some of the high-low deltas that you see? And
then from there, it's all about bringing people to the middle ground.
Well, in the case of that conflict, right? Because either one extreme has to adapt to the other extreme, or they find a place in the middle, or they just are at each other's throats for the rest of time, right? Because it's, again, if the conflict, by definition, if the conflict is with interdependent parties, at some point they got to figure it out. Now, sometimes they can figure it out on their own. One of the things I despise managers for, and I tell them that, is at the first sign of trouble, go talk to HR. And I call bullshit on that, if you'll pardon my expression. No, part of your job as a manager is to know how to handle that first level conflict. HR is there for a reason, but not until and a lot of times it's just, let's face it, if the manager is a high S's are classic conflict avoiders. They're people pleasers. So they have that tendency to be classic conflict avoiders. So it's just all part of the conversation around, you know, how much you handle at your level, how much you should delegate or delegate up to HR. And then in some cases, obviously, you have to bring in third parties to somehow mitigate the debate one way or the other. I actually have a client who's a professional mediator who I use when my clients run into those situations. Other questions on what we've talked about so far? So here's another. So as you might imagine, when you look at the disc and you look at page 2, you've got your natural and adaptive styles. The outer 2 styles are the task-orientated orientations, and the middle 2 are people orientation. You know, you can look at, when I said earlier, conflict management is both substantive and emotional. There's pretty well a direct correlation between, if the team is high D's and C's, that they're going to default to the substantive part of, they're going to be more comfortable with the substantive part of the conflict as opposed to the emotional, and vice versa for the S's and I's. They're going to tend to be more comfortable with the emotional and have a blind spot towards the substantive. So it just gives you, again, another connection point to, when you look at that profile, you can start to see some patterns as to how they might handle conflict and be able to, as a team, look at, you know, where might their blind spots be relative to their ability to communicate when things are heated. Other thoughts? So here's the third set of data that I use. I take the natural, and it's pretty easy to set up in a spreadsheet. So I take the natural style, I have my adaptive style, and then Mr. Excel does the calculations, and I look at how big is the delta in each one. So who has the biggest delta? And the reason I do that, it's a third piece of data that is, I find, very valuable when looking at the team, because we all know what that delta is. And, you know, sometimes we look at anything over 20. I've heard people say, look at everything over 30 is worth a conversation. So the number one driver of stress in the workplace is trying to pretend to be somebody that you're not naturally. So when you think about what the DISC tells us, it tells us how far away from natural we adapt. And of course, we're taught to talk about, is that sustainable? Is that not? Is that, what's the impact? But it's another place where we can find stressors, and by definition, or almost by default, a place where conflict is likely to occur. Right? Conflict rarely occurs when we're not stressed, because we're able to have meaningful conversations. But when we're stressed, conflict tends to raise its ugly head quicker, faster. So I purposely put that out there to say, here's where the stressors. And historically, now after doing this for 12 years and a couple thousand times, the biggest delta is usually in the S, stabilizing.
I have one that went from 99 to 17.
Yeah, I had a young lady that was a 99D, adaptive 10. She was an alpha female working for the government. Wasn't working very well. She quit that job and started her own business a week and a half after we had this conversation. So yet another, again, it's yet another place where the DISC can point to places where, not only individually, but on the team, where those stress points are likely to come from. And you can proactively say, okay, if the biggest delta as a team is in this stabilizing, what's going on? and more often than not, it's something along the lines of, you know, the business is running faster than we're comfortable with. We got chaos, we got, for whatever reasons. And so with that as a backdrop, you can proactively have the conversation. Okay, so when you're stressed out doing whatever it is you're doing, and somebody needs a resource that you also need, how do we manage that conversation? Right? Because that's a source of conflict. That is a perceived interference with one's own goals, because now we have a conflict between, let's say, you know, somebody needs a project manager. You know, this department needs this project manager, but this department also needs that same project manager. Well, now we have a conflict. Now we're going to arm wrestle over who gets this project manager and when. Classic conflict.
And then this part, with your spreadsheet you're talking about, you're going to go by individuals or by departments, and you're going to just be using that delta as your trigger point or your point of data.
I'm going to use the delta as another data point. Right. To say, you know, what's going on here? You know, if we have a one-on-one conversation or a team conversation, the team conversation, I can look at the team, because I average them all up, and I can see of all the 4 styles or the 4 dimensions, more often than not, you know, most teams, their delta in the stabilizing is usually double that of any of the others. That's just, if I were to just think back to the last dozen or so that I've done. And you're going to have, you know, it's going to vary by market. You know, nonprofit teams tend to have higher deltas in the S than for-profit teams, but they still have a big delta. So again, it's just another data point. Doesn't, you know, it may or may not predict something, but it gives us as coaches a place to start the conversation. And then, of course, individually, when I talk about stress, because I don't know about you, but I've never met a client that wasn't stressed about something. So it gives me a place to start that conversation. Like with this young lady, okay, you're a driver. You are a hard-charging, you know, natural hard-charging young woman. What the hell's going on? And of course, you come to find out that, you know, when you're working for a government agency, it's all about compliance. Well, you try to wrap that much compliance around a high D, forget about it. So it allowed us to have a very meaningful conversation around where that conflict was and where it was coming from. Other thoughts or questions? Maybe any specific cases that you've run into that I can help, you know, feed some ideas on how to debrief. Did I miss anything?
So Rick, this is Mike. I was looking for an example of somebody having to adapt up in the S.
Up in the S?
Yeah, and I thought I had one, but I haven't found it yet.
Okay.
So,
okay.
Everybody I have has adapted down, and some of them very significantly, as you pointed out.
Right.
But it would seem to me that if you were low S and you were in a situation where you had to, I'll say, pretend to be a higher S, that could be pretty annoying internally. I mean, it might be something you keep inside, but it like just tear you up.
Yeah, and where I see it, I tend to see more movement down in the D than movement up in the S. And here's typically what that looks like. It's somebody who knows that they're a high D, knows that if they just go high D in every situation, they're going to be ineffective because they're going to just ramrod right over their team. And so they're making a conscious effort to not be as D as they would naturally. So and of course the question I ask that we should all be asking is that sustainable? Right. So I had I have an eye example, for instance. So I have the young lady who worked for the government, was a high D, quit and started her own business. I have another woman who was a low I, and her adaptive was high I. It was a rather large jump. And so when we sat down and we talked about it, she is the public relations director for a hospital. She's an avowed introvert. I said, okay, how does that happen? How does an avowed introvert become the face of a hospital to the community? And she said, well, I wanted the job. I wanted to put myself out there, basically. And she said, so I go out and I do my events, and, I'm the face of the hospital, and, et cetera, et cetera. She said, but at the end of the day, as long as I can go back to my office and everything is order and organized and where it should be, then life is good. Right? So just because there's a big delta doesn't mean it's a problem, but you have to have the conversation to see whether it's sustainable or not. For the first example, it was not sustainable. For the second example, it was.
It's interesting, if I may. When it comes to D, from high to low, you're going in broad terms from a more aggressive behavior to a more mild behavior. And S, it's the opposite. You're going from, as a high S, you're going from predictable and passive to something that's active, chaotic, and spontaneous. So they're almost, those scales almost go opposite each other.
Right. And then, I was going back to, Mike's example. I think his example was a low S to a high S.
Right.
Which would be somewhat analogous, although not exactly, to a high D to a low D.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking. Okay.
The other piece of that is, people say, well, what does that mean just by looking at page 2? And especially for somebody who is, I'm sure maybe we've seen examples where somebody is kind of almost dead even across the board. Right. So what is that? There's no outliers. There's nothing that's obvious that they're a high D or a high this or that. I always go back to page 5, which is that table with all the adjectives. And I, just start correlating adjectives to those numerical values. And you can start to, build a profile just from that. Or when you have maybe 2, maybe 3 of the dimensions or the exact same numerical value, right? Put it in plain text terms so that you can build a vocabulary around that particular profile. But once again, once you understand the profile, then again, as we wrap it back around the topic of today, is, okay, how does that help you manage through conflict? And again, it's an automatic application because it's always there. And it's a problem that every team struggles with. So I just put it out there right from get-go. Now, how about your own comfort level with managing conflict? Right? Because that's part of the ability to facilitate is, being in tune with your own, how you manage conflict. Not that any of us have conflict in our lives, but.
So I'll give you a little testimonial here, Rick. So I've been with the network for about 3 years now, not quite
Cool.
3 years. And so my wife and I are both pretty high S. And so one of our ways of managing conflict is to go into a passive aggressive state. Now, fine, whatever. If that's what you want, kind of a mode. And what I've learned in these 3 years is that I cannot let that happen on either side, right? So I manage myself, and then I have to subtly manage her because nobody wants to be managed that way. But so you still do it, right?
Right.
So that's kind of a testimonial of trusted advisors. It has nothing to do with money or the outward looking thing, but the inward looking thing is pretty valuable.
Sure. And that's I'm glad you brought that up, Mike, because it's that passive aggressiveness that can really get clients into trouble. That avoiding conflict, right? It can really get businesses in a bad way quickly. You know, one of the things that that I've always done in my own corporate career, and I've introduced many a change in my own corporate career, is, and this is before I really used assessments in a meaningful way, but everybody in the room had to tell me what they thought. Nobody was leaving that room until I at least got an initial read on the reaction to the change that we just announced. Because you know how that goes. The high S's, you know, they're doing this in the room, and then in their head they're saying, Rick's an asshole. He doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. But I'm seeing this, and you know, that's that passive aggressiveness. So I'm glad you brought that up, because that can really compound the level of conflict that you have. And so that's one way to get past it, is you start looking around communication styles and you look at the high S's, and you know, I mean, they see on the slide when we get to here's a typical S profile, and they see that passive aggressiveness. It introduces the ability to say, okay, so, you know, how do you deal with change? You know, talk me through, how do you deal with conflict? Statistically, 80% of society avoids conflict. That's a pretty high number.
It's amazing. Does that mean you see a lot of high S's?
Well, I think statistically, close to 70% of society are high S's.
Okay.
Last time I looked at the statistics, I don't know, Wendy, if you have any that are recent, but last time I looked, it was in the high 60s or low 70s. S is the most represented disc style. That's all I have. So what other questions do you have on either conflict or disc or both?
I'm just trying to think of a way to put this together right away. I mean, just the way you went through the verbal part of it makes a lot of sense with a one-on-one. I think everything you were telling us today is probably even more valuable for a group to be able to like lay out and see how they would, the do's and don'ts you mentioned.
Right. And the reason I do so many teams is, I mean, let's face it, that's where the magic happens. I mean, we can coach individual people all day long, but at some point they got to go back to work as part of a team, even if you're the CEO. So that's why I tend to stress teams. Others? This helpful?
Very.
Is it?
Yep. Very.
So let's go once around the horn on a takeaway then, if you don't mind.
Hi, it's Cheryl. What I found very interesting was that, you know, compromise isn't good. I found that very interesting. A bit of partial satisfaction.
Yes, it's only good in the short term. Thank you. Who's next?
Well, I was just talking. I feel like I'm talking a lot. I'll just say that in almost everything in life, having a context to build something around makes it more understandable.
Yes.
It makes that story more human. It makes, you know, this idea of imparting information about somebody, which I always find people are fascinated by it. I think putting it into context of conflict, because it is everywhere, just gives it that much more, you know, adhesive. So I like that part of it the best.
You'll find that it's not a stretch. Anytime we can help our clients get comfortable with conflict, we're a hero. It really, people are losing sleep out there over their inability to manage conflict, whether at home, at work, both. They're teenagers, you know, you name it. It's just such a, it's so commonplace that it's a natural place for that context. Mike, how about you?
So it opened up a new line of thinking for me, and how to focus on the yes, and particularly the adaptation in that style from natural to how the other people are seeing them.
Okay.
And so that to me is pretty important from a team conflict recognition as well as resolution.
Okay. Cool. Virginia, how about you?
I really liked the added dimension of the 5 conflict management styles and trying to tie what you learn about DISC into how to operate in that upper right corner.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, you think about it, you could have an entire exercise around what would it take for this team to be able to collaborate. Since
Right.
that is the end goal for almost every team. What would it take, now that we know what we know about each other, what would it take to have that balance between our own issues and the other people's issues?
And I know I've talked to you in the past, Rick, about some group debriefs that I did, but the other thing I would just add is I've used the DISC, actually all 3 of them, in one-on-one engagements.
Mm-hmm.
I had, for example, I had a nonprofit where I coached 2 different people and different jobs, but what I wound up doing was group debriefs with them and their boss, the person who hired me. And that brought out a lot of insights in terms of what was causing them conflict with each other. So I think
Cool.
it's valuable with that, even a team of 2.
Yes.
So.
Only takes 2 to do the dance, to do the conflict dance. Linda, how about you?
As I said, I'm about to do a project with a group of 16. Turns out that there's a new CEO, and she's just come in, and she's got this team that she's trying to assess.
Right.
She's done a lot of observations, but now she wants me to come in, and we're going to do DISC Plus, DISC and Values.
Cool.
And I think this is a great way to present stuff. Some of the things you mentioned as to how you present it, I think is going to give her an awful lot of insight.
Awesome.
Which is great. Yeah. Thank you.
Cleveland?
Yeah, so I think you just gave me a whole new level of understanding on some of the aspects of DISC and just how you go about it. That could be helpful most definitely in the future, and particularly as you discuss the correlation between D's and S's and the adaptive, natural versus adaptive. That was pretty insightful and personal.
Very cool. Vicki, how about you?
I think the biggest takeaway is, we go through the assessments and we always say, this is your how you deal with conflict and how you should talk to people and that. And I never saw it the way that you developed the sheet for them to be able to talk to people on their team. I think that's key in communication in the future for that team to work great together.
Yep. It's all about communication. Well, my contact information for those that don't have it is on the last page of the presentation that I gave to Wendy. So literally, if you have any questions that, we get off the call and I say, oh man, I wish I'd asked that question, feel free to reach out.
Could I slip a question in now?
Sure.
In doing this, you're going into a company, you have 16 people, you do DISC analysis with all of them. You get a fee most likely for that. From there, once you get this information, how do you then turn that into a leadership program or a sales coaching program or whatever it might be? How do you start to take it from here to the next level?
I haven't used this as a marketing tool in quite some time. You cannot become a client of mine without taking the advanced insights.
Okay.
So it's how I start every engagement, right? It's just like, if you want to start a journey, you got to know where you're starting from. If you want to improve performance on a piece of machinery, you got to get data on how it's performing now. So I don't use the assessments as a marketing tool. I mean, just by virtue of how I market my business, but so usually we already know what kind of coaching engagement we're into. I just use the assessment as a place to start the conversation so that we're all on the same page as far as where we are and what we're working with.
Okay.
Of course, I use it as a coach because I keep the results handy and I look at them before each and every conversation so that I know how to communicate with them. Right?
Okay.
And if you want to, just one more tidbit, the page before page 19, page 18 is their learning and teaching style. And so as a coach, if you look at their learning style, it gives you a sense of how you might coach them. So, for
And
whatever
Rick,
that's worth.
just my 2 cents worth. I think those 2 pages, if I'm going into a debrief situation and don't want to give them the whole report all at once, those are the 2 pages that I pull.
Yeah.
Learning and communication. And to answer your question, Robert, is in the situation I was mentioning, I made an original preliminary proposal, and it just was not within the realm of the budget at the time. And the CEO was very gracious and said, I really want to work with you. Can you revise this? And I went, you betcha. So we did. We revised the proposal somewhat, but she's already talking about when the budget allows, this is what I want to do. And I think once you present the leader of a team or whatever the situation is with these results, in a lot of cases, they almost speak for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, you'll see things in the debrief that scream the necessity for a leadership process or, executive leadership process or whatever that happens to be.
Okay. Thank you.
Cool. All right. Hopefully we'll see you guys at Power Summit next month.
Yeah. Thanks,
All
Rick.
Thank you.
Thank
All
you,
right.
Rick.
All right. Take care.
Take
Bye-bye.
care, everybody.